On the morning of October 14, 1943, 60 American bombers were shot down over Germany in a single day. More than 500 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured before noon. The men who survived that mission came back, convinced that daylight strategic bombing of Germany was impossible without fighter protection across the full length of the route. No fighter in the Allied arsenal had the range to follow them where they needed to go. And this is the part nobody talks about. The strategic bombing campaign that the United States Army Air Forces launched against Germany from England in 1942 rested on a single fundamental assumption. The assumption was that formations of heavy bombers, flying in tight defensive boxes at high altitude, could protect themselves against enemy fighter attack through the combined firepower of their own gun positions, survive long enough over German territory to destroy the industrial targets they had been sent to find. This theory had been developed in the interwar period by instructors at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama. It had seemed credible in 1935, when the fighters that existed were slow and had limited altitude capability. By 1943, it was no longer credible. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109G had made it something considerably closer to a death sentence. The 8th Air Force began conducting raids over German territory in strength during the spring and summer of 1943. The losses that summer were serious enough to attract attention at the highest levels of the American command structure in Washington and London. On June 13, 1943, a mission to the naval facilities at Kiel lost 22 bombers out of 60 that crossed the German coast. On July 28, a raid on the Focke-Wulf assembly plant at Oschersleben lost 15 aircraft before the formation even reached its target. On August 1st, the low-level raid on the oil refinery complex at Ploiești in Romania, conducted by the 9th Air Force from bases in North Africa, destroyed 54 out of 179 B-24 Liberators that took part. A loss rate of 30% in a single afternoon that was catastrophic by any standard of sustainable attrition in a prolonged strategic air campaign. The event that brought the crisis to a definitive point was the second Schweinfurt raid of October 14, 1943, the mission American airmen called Black Thursday. Schweinfurt was a city in Bavaria that contained the largest concentration of ball-bearing manufacturing plants in Germany. The planners of the 8th Air Force had identified it as a target on the theory that destroying those plants would simultaneously cripple German armored vehicle and aircraft production. The mission that day sent 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into Bavaria without fighter escort beyond the German border. Lost 60 aircraft destroyed, 17 written off after landing, 121 more damaged, with 594 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions into Germany the following morning. The core problem was range. The two fighter types available to the 8th Air Force in the autumn of 1943 were the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V. The Spitfire had been designed as a short-range interceptor for the air defense of Britain. Its operational radius over enemy territory, even with a small external fuel tank attached beneath the fuselage, was roughly 175 miles from its English bases. That meant it could escort the bomber formations as far as the Dutch or Belgian coast before the pilots were compelled to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a heavier and inherently longer-ranged aircraft. With two 75-gallon drop tanks fitted to its wings, it could reach as far as the German border, approximately 375 miles from the airfields in East Anglia, before a fuel consumption forced it to disengage. Neither aircraft could get anywhere near the targets that the campaign required. The aircraft that would solve this problem had already been designed and was already in production. But it had not arrived in England in numbers sufficient to make a difference. The officers responsible for its employment had not yet grasped the full extent of what it was capable of doing under the right conditions. The North American P-51 Mustang had begun as a British contract in April 1940, when the Royal Air Force's Purchasing Commission in the United States had approached North American Aviation in Los Angeles with a request to manufacture Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license for British service. North American's president, James Kindleberger, told the British representatives that his company could design and build an entirely new aircraft faster than it could retool to produce someone else's existing design. The British Commission gave him 120 days to deliver a flying prototype. North American delivered it in 117. The aircraft that flew for the first time on October 26, 1940. Was in aerodynamic terms a generation ahead of most of what was flying in European skies at that moment. Its laminar flow wing, developed in collaboration with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics at Langley Field in Virginia, reduced drag across the wing surface by a factor that North American's engineers calculated at roughly 2.5 times compared to conventional airfoil designs of the period. It carried more fuel internally than any comparable single-seat fighter then in operational service anywhere. Its radiator installation was arranged so that the heated air discharged from the engine cooling system generated a small but measurable quantity of additional thrust at cruise altitude. The problem was the engine. The Allison V1 710 that powered the early Mustang models produced adequate power at low altitude, but fell badly short above 15,000 feet. That was precisely where the bombers and the fighters contesting them operated. The transformation came in the spring of 1942, when a Royal Air Force test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang Mark I at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment and wrote a brief report afterwards suggesting that if the Allison engine were replaced by a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the resulting aircraft might be the best single-engine fighter available to any Air Force in the world. Rolls-Royce engineers completed the first conversion in October 1942. The results exceeded the predictions that had been made for it. The Merlin-powered Mustang was faster than the Spitfire Mark IX above 20,000 feet, faster than the Focke-Wulf 190A at all altitudes above 15,000 feet. Had a range that, when measured at the lean cruise power settings the Merlin could sustain at altitude, was more than twice the combat radius of any variant of the Spitfire. Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit had been producing the Merlin under license since 1940. The production base was already established and running. North American began delivering Merlin-powered P-51Bs to the 8th Air Force in England in November 1943. What the P-51B could do with external fuel tanks was something that no American fighter pilot or planner had been required to think about before. This was because no previous American fighter had possessed the internal fuel capacity and the aerodynamic efficiency to make the question worth asking. The aircraft carried 184 gallons of fuel in its internal tanks. That was already exceptional for a single-engine fighter of its weight and structural dimensions. With two 75-gallon drop tanks fitted to the wing hardpoints, the total fuel load rose to 334 gallons, with two 108-gallon paper composition tanks. That North American and the Army Air Forces had been developing through the summer of 1943 based on an earlier British design, the figure rose further still. The critical calculation, worked out by navigation officers at the 8th Air Force Headquarters at Bushy Park in late 1943, was that a P-51B carrying two 108-gallon drop tanks and flying at the lean cruise settings that the Merlin engine could sustain at altitude had a combat radius of approximately 850 miles. The distance from the 8th Air Force's primary airfields in East Anglia to the center of Berlin was 560 miles. The man who would lead the first fighter escort to the German capital was at that moment commanding the 4th Fighter Group at Debden in Essex. His name was Colonel Donald James Blakesley. He had been born in Fairport Harbor, Ohio, on September 11, 1917. He had come to England before the United States entered the war, one of several hundred young Americans who had crossed the Atlantic to join the Royal Canadian Air Force and then transferred to the Royal Air Force in 1941. Flying Spitfires with the Eagle Squadrons, the volunteer American units that the RAF had organized from the men who had decided to fight before their own country was prepared to. When the 3 Eagle Squadrons were transferred to the United States Army Air Forces in September 1942 and redesignated as the 4th Fighter Group, Blakesley came with them. By the autumn of 1943, he had more combat flying hours against the Luftwaffe than almost any other American officer stationed in England. When the first P-51Bs arrived at Debden in January 1944. Blakesley's group had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts and was scheduled under the standard transition procedures for several weeks of familiarization, flying and ground instruction before taking the new aircraft into combat operations. Blakesley went to the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command and told the commanding general, William Kepner, that the 4th Fighter Group would not spend those weeks on the ground. He told Kepner that his pilots would learn the P-51 in combat, that there was no time for a formal transition period while the bomber formations were losing aircraft and crews over Germany every week the weather permitted flying, that he would take personal responsibility for whatever resulted from the decision. Kepner authorized the accelerated conversion. The 4th Fighter Group flew its first P-51 combat mission on February 20, 1944, the opening day of Operation Argument, the concentrated 6-day bombing campaign that American airmen called Big Week. The commanding general of the 8th Air Force at that point was no longer Ira Eaker, who had built the organization from its original 7 aircraft and 12 officers in 1942, but had been moved to the Mediterranean theater in December 1943. His replacement, who had taken command on January 6, 1944, was Lieutenant General James Harold Doolittle, most widely known to the public for having led the carrier-launched raid on Tokyo in April 1942. Doolittle arrived at the 8th Air Force headquarters at Bushy Park, and within days had made a decision that would alter the conduct of the air war over Germany more fundamentally than any tactical adjustment since the campaign had begun. He found, posted on the wall of the operations room, a standing order that had governed 8th Air Force fighter operations from the beginning. The order stated that the primary mission of escort fighters was the protection of the bomber formations, that fighters were not to pursue enemy aircraft that broke off an engagement and turned away. Doolittle rescinded the order. He replaced it with a directive that was almost its precise opposite. Under the new standing order issued in January 1944, the primary mission of 8th Air Force fighters was not to protect bombers, but to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, in the air and on the ground, whether or not the German aircraft encountered posed any immediate threat to the bomber stream in progress. Fighters were authorized to pursue German aircraft to their recovery airfields, strafe them on the runway, attack fuel and ammunition storage facilities, engage enemy formations at any point along the route that presented an opportunity. The theory was that the previous standing order had made American fighters reactive, defending a geographic point rather than taking the offensive, had allowed the Luftwaffe to attack the bombers on its own terms while the escort was constrained from pressing the fight. Doolittle had concluded that the Luftwaffe had to be destroyed as a functioning air defense force before any ground invasion of France could be seriously attempted. There was one additional technical modification that made the full potential range of the P-51 available for operational missions. It was a modification that nearly every pilot who flew the aircraft actively disliked during the period when it most mattered. In the autumn of 1943, engineers at North American Aviation had proposed adding an 85-gallon fuel tank behind the pilot seat inside the fuselage. occupying space that had previously contained radio equipment and a section of structural framing. The tank was fitted to all P-51B and P-51C aircraft manufactured after late 1943, to the newer P-51D, beginning with its introduction into service in the summer of 1944, when the fuselage tank was full. The aircraft's center of gravity shifted rearward to a point at which directional stability was noticeably reduced. Multiple pilots noted that the Mustang became difficult to manage with the precision that air combat required at that condition. The standard operating procedure that developed in the winter of 1943 and 1944 was to burn the fuselage tank down as quickly as practical in the early outbound portion of the mission, accepting the handling penalty at a point where enemy contact was statistically unlikely, then continuing on the wing tanks and internal wing fuel for the remainder of the Escort. Big Week, which ran from February 20th to February 25th, 1944, demonstrated in operational terms what the combination of long-range fighters, drop tanks, Doolittle's aggressive standing orders could produce. The 8th Air Force flew more than 3,300 heavy bomber sorties during those 6 days, more than it had flown in any comparable period since the campaign began. The P-51 groups escorted them as far as Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, positions deep inside Germany that had previously required the bombers to fly without fighter coverage for the most dangerous sections of the penetration route. The Luftwaffe rose to meet the attacks in strength on each of those days. This was because it could not allow the aircraft manufacturing plants to be destroyed without opposition. The American fighter pilots, released from the requirement to hold station around the formations, pursued them without restraint at every available opportunity. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 355 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded during Big Week, against American losses of 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters. Numbers that represented severe punishment inflicted on both sides, but that were sustainable for the Americans in a way they were not sustainable for the Germans. The target that had not yet been reached was Berlin. The German capital was the largest city in Europe, the seat of the National Socialist government, the center of a substantial industrial complex that included electrical equipment manufacturing at the Robert Bosch facilities, aero engine production at the Daimler-Benz plant at Genshagen south of the city, ball bearing manufacturing at the VKF plant in the Erkner district to the southeast. Above all, it was the target whose symbolic weight exceeded every other city in Germany. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe from his headquarters in England. Doolittle had both identified Berlin as the culminating objective of the winter campaign against the German air defense system. Reaching it with bombers alone would not achieve what the campaign required. To accomplish anything beyond a single costly gesture, the bombers would need fighter escort throughout. That meant the P-51 groups would have to fly more than 1,100 miles on a round trip, a figure that even in the autumn of 1943 would have appeared as a practical impossibility. The first attempt on Berlin was scheduled for March 3, 1944. Weather over the North Sea and across Germany proper had been deteriorating for several days before the planned mission date. The forecast on the morning of March 3rd was marginal enough that the mission was recalled after the lead formations had already departed their airfields and crossed the English coast heading east. Most of the groups turned back and recovered without incident. One group, the 95th Bombardment Group based at Horham in Suffolk, either failed to receive the recall signal or received it too late to act on it, continued eastward with its assigned escort until it was recalled a second time over Denmark. The mission was rescheduled for March 4th. On that day, a small number of aircraft from the 95th and two other bomb groups penetrated to the Berlin metropolitan area through solid overcast that prevented visual bombing, released their loads on Pathfinder radar guidance, It was the first time American aircraft had dropped bombs on the German capital. The fighter escort for those aircraft included P-51s from Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, the mission that the 8th Air Force mounted on March 6, 1944. Was different in scale and stated intent from the radar attacks of 2 days earlier. The operational order called for approximately 730 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators to attack Berlin in clear weather with visual bombing against industrial targets across the city and its immediate suburbs. 5 fighter groups equipped with P-51s were assigned as close and target area escort, together with P-47 groups that would cover the initial and final sections of the route where their shorter range permitted them to operate effectively. The escort planning was constructed to ensure that no portion of the bomber stream would go without fighter cover for more than approximately 15 minutes at any point between the English coast and the target area. It was the most ambitious escort operation the 8th Air Force had attempted against any target in the 22 months since its first mission in August 1942. The Luftwaffe's response on March 6th was the largest single-day commitment of German fighter strength that the Air Defense Command had yet concentrated against an American raid. The Jagdgeschwader units based across northern and central Germany were scrambled in successive waves as the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast heading east. The German ground controllers directed the interceptions with a degree of coordination that reflected both the seriousness with which the High Command regarded a raid on the capital itself and the quality of the radar and communications network that had been built across occupied Europe. What the German fighter pilots encountered over the route to Berlin was different from what they had met on previous deep penetration raids into central Germany. The America escort fighters did not hold formation around the bomber boxes. They pressed forward into the German formations and engaged at every altitude. When German fighters broke off and turned toward their recovery airfields, the P-51s followed them. The air battle on March 6th extended across a corridor roughly 400 miles long and several miles wide, from the Dutch-German border east to the outskirts of the capital itself. The fighting continued from shortly after 10 in the morning local time until early afternoon. The 4th Fighter Group, flying P-51Bs with Blakesley leading, engaged a substantial formation of Focke-Wulf 190s that had assembled to execute a head-on attack against the lead bomber box. The engagement dispersed the German formation before it could complete its pass. Other P-51 groups intercepted Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine heavy fighters that the Luftwaffe had been using to fire unguided rockets into the bomber stream from positions outside the effective range of the American gunners. Destroyed, several of them for they could reach their firing positions. The fighters assigned to the target area circled over Berlin itself, while the heavy bombers made their bombing runs below them. Visible from the streets of the city as small, bright points moving against the contrail tracks left by the heavies. The losses on March 6th were the heaviest the 8th Air Force had suffered in a single day since Black Thursday 5 months earlier. 69 heavy bombers failed to return. 11 fighters were lost, against a German loss figure that American intelligence initially estimated at more than 80 aircraft and later revised downward to approximately 66 confirmed kills. 577 American airmen were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. The mission had reached Berlin and had bombed it in force. The escort had held the route open well enough that the bomber losses, severe as they were distributed across the entire length of the penetration rather than concentrated in any single unprotected stretch where an unescorted formation could be systematically destroyed by concentrated Luftwaffe attacks. General Doolittle's assessment, recorded in the 8th Air Force operational diary for that date, noted that the escort had performed its mission and that the new approach had prevented the kind of catastrophic concentrated interception that had eliminated 60 bombers in a single engagement over Schweinfurt 5 months earlier. What March 6th confirmed. What the missions that followed through the spring of 1944 demonstrated with increasing consistency was that the Luftwaffe fighter force defending Germany was approaching the limit of its ability to absorb casualties at the rate being imposed on it by the American escort groups flying free across the full length of the route. The fundamental arithmetic of the situation had been understood by a small number of analysts inside the Army Air Force's intelligence apparatus since the late autumn of 1943, but it had not been translated into operational practice until Doolittle changed the standing orders and the P-51 groups arrived in sufficient strength to implement the new approach. The Luftwaffe had manufactured approximately 25,000 fighter aircraft of all types between 1939 and the end of 1943. The irreplaceable element in the German air defense system was not aircraft. Germany could still produce fighter airframes faster than the American escort fighters were destroying them in air combat. The irreplaceable element was pilots. The Luftwaffe's flying training program had produced approximately 60,000 trained aircrew between 1939 and 1943. By the winter of that year, the training pipeline was under severe strain because the simultaneous demands of the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean theater. The intensifying air defense of Germany itself had consumed experienced instructors faster than new ones could be developed to replace them. The average Luftwaffe fighter pilot defending German airspace in the spring of 1944 had completed a training program that had been compressed from the 260 hours of flight time that the class of 1939 had received to somewhere between 110 and 160 hours, depending on the individual school and the availability of aviation fuel for training purposes. The P-51 pilots they were engaging had completed training programs requiring 300 hours of flight time before operational assignment, were arriving at their squadrons with instrument flying capability, formation discipline, gunnery proficiency that the abbreviated German syllabus no longer had the time or the fuel to provide. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,262 fighter pilots killed or permanently incapacitated over the defense of Germany and the western approaches, a figure derived from the Luftwaffe Quartermaster General's loss records captured at the end of the war and analyzed by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in its report on the German Air Force published in 1945. Against the same 6-month period, the 8th Air Force had lost approximately 800 fighter pilots. The differential was not sustainable for either side indefinitely, but it was the German side that would reach the point of exhaustion first. The Luftwaffe was not critically short of aircraft in the spring of 1944. It was running short of men who had been trained with sufficient thoroughness to fly those aircraft effectively enough to contest formations of P-51s flown by pilots with twice as many hours in their logbooks. By the time Allied ground forces landed on the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to intervene over the invasion area had been reduced to the point where it flew fewer than 100 sorties over the beachhead on the first day of operations, against an Allied Air Force that flew more than 14,000 sorties in direct support of the landings. The German ground commanders who had incorporated into their defensive planning the assumption that the Luftwaffe could contest any Allied amphibious landing with sufficient strength to disrupt the supply chain during the critical opening 48 hours found themselves looking at a sky filled entirely with aircraft carrying the roundels of the Royal Air Force and the White Star of the United States Army Air Forces. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in northern France, had told his staff repeatedly in the months before the invasion that whoever controlled the air over the landing area on the first day would effectively decide the outcome of the battle for Normandy. By the afternoon of June 6th, the answer was not in any doubt. The accounting of what the P-51 escort campaign had cost and what it had produced was assembled in detail by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in the months following the German surrender in May 1945. The 8th Air Force's fighter groups had flown approximately 213,000 escort sorties between January 1944 and May 1945. The P-51 groups had claimed the majority of German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat during that period, accounting for approximately 4,950 confirmed victories out of the roughly 8,000 total credited to 8th Air Force Fighter Command across all aircraft types. Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group alone had destroyed 1,016 enemy aircraft by the end of the war, the highest total of any fighter group in the 8th Air Force, at a cost of 241 pilots killed. When Albert Speer sat across a table from Paul Nitze and John Kenneth Galbraith at Glucksburg Castle in May 1945, and admitted that he had never believed Germany could win an industrial war against the United States. Part of what he was describing was a campaign fought at altitudes above 20,000 feet by pilots following a standing order that had been written in January 1944 by a general who had walked into an operations room, looked at the wall, decided that the order posted there was wrong,